seeing the slides as they move along. But thank you so much for joining us today. This is our first virtual webinar during our time of social distancing, so we really appreciate you all taking the time to spend your lunch break or maybe just the middle of your day with us. So I want to give you a quick overview. This is Dr. Mark Southerland, and he is an ecologist at Tetra Tech and was the primary author of the EPA National Program Guidance on Biological Criteria, lead consultant on the MBSS for Maryland DNR, and consultant to MDE on impaired waters, stressor identification, and TMDL programs. He has helped 18 counties and cities in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and South Carolina to develop stormwater programs and comply with the Chesapeake Bay and local TMDLs. Mark has served on the boards of the Maryland Water Monitoring Council, Howard County Environmental Sustainability, Howard County Conservancy, the Science Council of the Maryland Academy of Sciences, and Patapsco Heritage Greenway. So thank you, Dr. Southerland, for joining us today, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Can everyone hear me? Hopefully everyone can. I'm going to advance the first slide to make sure that's working. There's a slight delay. I'm not seeing the advanced slide yet. Oh, I see. That's interesting. Okay. There we go. Okay, here we are. Can everyone see the outline? First of all, I'd like to thank all of you cool frogs and tadpoles for joining us today. And if that means anything to you, you've probably been binge watching Tiger King on Netflix. If not, I still welcome everyone joining me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to folks, even if it's virtual, and talk about this important topic. I jumped away from the outline again. I'm just trying to see why my controls are slow. So, Anna, can you tell me what you're seeing right now? Is it by any other name?
Yep, it says by any other name on the screen. Try clicking it maybe. Sometimes I know it lags a little bit.
Yeah, so I was trying to, okay, it is quite a lag. So let me just see if I can get this going a little more smoothly. Interesting. Trying to go back one slide. That's skipping a slide for some reason. There we are. Okay, everyone. So, vernal pools, a topic which I think some of you may be very familiar with and some of which you may not, and that's great so that we can all learn more about these really unique ecosystems that are right in your backyard. So the outline of what I'm going to talk about, and I can take questions as we go, and I'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. But I'm going to cover the topic in three sets. One is what are vernal pools? We'll define them, how they're created, who lives there. Hopefully you'll have a very good feeling. And I think it's a fairly straightforward process, but again, one which most people are completely unaware of. Then after we learn about them, we'll say, why should we care about them? How do we know that they exist? Their values to the ecosystem as well as to people. And then we'll talk about what you can do. So we'll leave you at the end of today's session with some things you can do personally or with other folks. So, vernal pools. Those of you who are familiar or took Latin in school will know that vernal means spring. And that's the most commonly used name, but there are many other names. Seasonal pools would be the most accurate because the seasons vary a bit depending on what part of the country you're in and the precipitation patterns that occur. But they are temporary pools. They're also ephemeral ponds, spring ponds, semi-permanent pools, woodland pools, and geographically isolated wetlands. All topics or names that are used for vernal pools. And I will just use the word vernal pools, but it's the same as all those other names. And this slide is me in Mexico last summer. And just to indicate that vernal pools are everywhere, you see that that's signage there says seasonal water pools, and above it says La Aguada, so that's Spanish. So that's even another name that can be applied, and they're appreciated around the world. So what are the characteristics of a vernal pool? And this is what's important, and it's fairly straightforward. When you have all of these in your head, you'll know what a vernal pool is. They are isolated from permanent surface waters. They're small and generally shallow. They periodically dry. They have distinctive biological communities, and the ecosystem actually includes a woodland extent as well. That's certainly the case in the eastern United States, more open areas, and actually even some of the eastern shore areas have more open vernal pool context. So isolation, no permanent surface water connections to other water bodies. So vernal pool is not a stream. It's not a pond that's permanent. They're not connected, they are isolated. So they're individual depressions. And the depressions can come from a variety of different sources. They can be a former stream channel. Those of you familiar with stream morphology will recognize that a meandering stream will sometimes cut off a meander, a bend, and create a little oxbow wetland. And those can be vernal pools if they dry out part of the year. They can just be an overtopping of the stream into the floodplain, create a wet area that lasts for a period of time that dries up. They can be swales that collect rainwater. They can be perched basins. Anywhere in the uplands, if there's a relatively impermeable soil underneath that holds water. Woodland hollow, pit and mound topography within a woodland swamp, or other ones that have been described. They can be human created as well. Landscape changes that have been made over time. Specifically, you can create one as a cattle pond that may end up being a vernal pool after use. It can be various kinds of logging or landscape change that created, again, a depression in the landscape. Even a tree falling down can create a vernal pool if it captures enough water for a long enough period of time. And roadside ditches are the smallest and most ephemeral, but sometimes can attain the status of a vernal pool.
Hey, Mark, if you've lost control of the slides, just use your mouse to click the screen one more time.
Okay. So I click the screen and...
Now you're controlling. Nope, you're fine. Just anywhere on your screen. You're good.
Well, now I've gone to here again, right? There we go. Hydrology. So now we're going to delve just a little bit into those different topic areas that I mentioned. We talked about isolation and hydrology, because again, it's about the water. The water regime has alternating wet and dry periods, and that's part of the definition. And the amount or the frequency that you have wet and dry periods can vary. It's typically annual, where you have part of the year wet, part of the year dry, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you can have drought years where they don't appear. Sometimes you have wet periods where they may last more than a year. But typically it's annual. And we'll describe how they get change over time in the next slide. Climatic differences obviously are important. The actual characteristics of the depression that the water resides in is important. It can fill from rainfall, can fill from surface runoff, intermittent stream flow, groundwater. Once the groundwater reaches a certain level and rises up, it can fill a vernal pool. And overland flooding, as I mentioned before. And the drying part occurs when temperature goes up and evapotranspiration through vegetation increases. So this is a graphic depiction of what I just described for the hydrology. And this is really the key. If you think about a year and you're in the fall and you've just gotten through a nice hot summer and the vernal pool is completely dry. You don't even notice it's there, but it is a little bit lower point in the landscape. And as it begins to rain and the vegetation dies back for the year, it begins to fill. And you can see here that we're going up in centimeters to a maximum generally about a foot. That's about how deep they get, so they're relatively shallow. You can see how it just increases over the winter. And then when you get to late winter, early spring, it's at its maximum depth and aerial extent as usually, and then as temperatures go up and the plants start to leaf out and evapotranspiration increases, it begins to dry them out. They dry out through the spring into the summer, and this can obviously vary a lot, but typical pattern is by the end of the summer, they are completely dry. And why is that important? This is the key feature of vernal pools. It's that they have no permanent fish populations. And when they dry, they eliminate any fish, and that's the important feature. That's why they're different than permanent ponds and lakes and streams and rivers, etc. Because water bodies that have no fish allow animals to breed, to lay their eggs, to raise their larvae without fish predation. And there are certain species that can only survive in this situation. In other words, they are so vulnerable to fish that they cannot successfully reproduce if there are fish in the water body. So the animals have that advantage, and therefore they have to, but they also have to deal with the drying. So animals such as invertebrates like fairy shrimp can deal with the drying part by having eggs that can survive over the dry part. And other animals have to leave the pond. And of course, that's what amphibians do. Amphibians are partly terrestrial and partly aquatic. There are also certain plants that like vernal pools in particular because of that hydrologic regime. Seems like I'm jumping too each time I push the button, but anyway, thanks for hanging in there. Distinct biota, as I just mentioned, there are certain animals that are obligate, which means that they require a vernal pool to complete their life cycle. There's a variety of invertebrates. Fairy shrimp is the most common one, but there are other kinds. Various other crustaceans, insects, and other invertebrates, as you can see on the slide there. Amphibians are perhaps the most spectacular and I think the most valued members. The mole salamanders, which we'll talk a little bit more about, wood frogs and eastern spadefoots need vernal pools. And they're also facultative species as well that will use a vernal pool but can also survive in other habitats. For example, that spotted turtle in the lower right, which is I think my favorite turtle. Okay, now you know what a vernal pool is. We can stop right now and we'll be good. In the last 10 minutes, hopefully everyone has a good grasp of what they are. But how are they created? Give you a better feel for why they're on the landscape where they are. Geological processes, there are more vernal pools typically in the north part of the country because of glaciation, carving out more of those depressions in the landscape. But local erosion can cause them. Migration of stream channels, as I described, can all happen. As I mentioned, human alteration, working agricultural landscapes where you gouge out the landscape for various reasons, quarries, farm ponds, detention ponds, logging roads, ditches, all can create something when they're abandoned that operates as a vernal pool. The soils are quite important. If you have a depression in a sandy soil that infiltrates water quickly, it won't hold the water long enough to operate as a vernal pool. And so you need a basically impermeable layer there to some extent. Emergent vegetation can be there and affect it. Sphagnum moss is a common vegetation in vernal pools. Forgive my phone, which is going. Mid-Atlantic, where we are, typical couple of special types out there beyond the ones you'll find in the landscape here in Howard County are Delmarva bays, and we'll have a little video at the end that describes that, and the sinkhole ponds in the Shenandoah Valley, again, are sort of atypical types of vernal pools. Vegetation types, I mentioned that again, there's quite a bit of variability. There are some that are more open canopy. The larger ones, obviously, will have a more open canopy, and but they'll have and support various things like sedges, rushes, duckweed, ferns, and sphagnum. Then there's some that have scrub shrub plants such as spicebush, hidebush, blueberry, buttonbush. There are those that are early in the forest, and those are the most common about in this region. Yellow birch, ashes, oaks, hemlock, cyprium, common trees that you'll see in the vernal pool habitat. And again, these forested wetlands can be described both as the buffer, detritus layer, shades, different kinds of ones, depending on how the vegetation and the landscape looks. That one, okay. So here's just some examples. After we saw the cover slide, you can just see these are things many of you may have walked across and seen on your hiking through the woods, and may not have known that they're a vernal pool. In some cases, if they're only there when there's a heavy rain and disappear quickly, they don't operate as a vernal pool because they're not there long enough. But in many cases, they're there throughout the winter and dry out in the summer and provide these unique habitat features and support these very cool animals. Okay, I'm trying to go one at a time, and it's not wanting me to do that. See, it's jumping to. Okay, there we are. Yeah, apologize for that. But why should we care? So now we've seen what vernal pools look like. We know how they're created. We know what's there. Why should we care? Ecological services for species. As I mentioned before, they are required for certain amphibians and invertebrates to live. And they can't occur anywhere else. So if we don't have any vernal pools, we don't have any of those animals. They provide a spot in the landscape for terrestrial and aquatic food webs. Again, they're that intersection where you have animals that use them, many different kinds of animals, including birds. The rusty blackbird turns out uses a lot of its time around vernal pools, which is a relatively new research finding. And so they're in essence stepping stones within the landscape. You might see just what seems like a very homogeneous set of woods, but if they have vernal pools in it, they support a lot more animals of various types. That's why they're important on the ecosystem scale, but they're also important for people because they provide pollution removal, groundwater replenishment, natural mosquito control, and connection to nature. And I'll talk about those just a little bit more. Okay, I'm just making sure this is moving properly. So replenishing groundwater. You know, those of you who are familiar with stormwater management, the impacts that have, recognize that our landscapes have changed and we're shunting water off of the landscape downstream faster and more erosively than would happen in a natural forest. Because the natural forest will infiltrate water into the ground as it naturally would with that disturbance. And vernal pools act as those kinds of features. So you can imagine the vernal pool is in essence all of these stormwater retention features, a bio-retention cell, a rain garden that we're putting in the landscapes to do what nature would normally do. And vernal pool is an example of where it would normally do it. It gathers water and infiltrates it, replenishing our groundwater, which is critical for feeding our streams as well as providing groundwater resource. And I'm just making sure we're okay. Removing pollution, as I just mentioned, they are in essence nature's rain garden. So they remove pollutants by capturing the water supply and running it into the soil. In essence, they can metabolize nitrogen better than most other areas because they are generally anoxic soils. Soils that are wet do a better job of capturing nitrogen than those that aren't. So in actuality, they perform better than most of the bioretention or rain gardens that we install. The mosquitoes. This is an issue that people will come up with, and it's true that any piece of water will begin to breed mosquitoes, but what's good about a vernal pool is that they include, well, no fish, many other animals, including invertebrates that will eat those mosquitoes and create an ecosystem role where the mosquitoes are at low levels. Virtually all of them, as you can see here, a single dragonfly nymph can consume more than 100 mosquito larvae in a 24-hour period. So they're food sources for the other animals that live in vernal pools. It's really the mosquitoes that occur in much smaller open water areas that don't have any other animals in it, like pots, pipes, tarps, toys, things like that, that really create the mosquito problem that we sometimes face. So the second part of the effect of the advantage to people is that really, I like to think of vernal pools as your backyard ecosystem. We talk about Chesapeake Bay, we talk about Rocky Mountains, we talk about these large-scale ecosystems, but this is one that is really small scale, can be in your backyard, can be in your local park, can be very nearby, and within, you know, a few hundred feet, the entire context of the vernal pool and how it operates, the animals support are in a small space that you can really, you can almost get your hands around. They include unique amphibians and unique invertebrates. Again, if we don't have these, we don't have these species, and part of our biodiversity is lost. They also provide connectivity for metapopulations, which is the concept that you might have a number of salamanders, a population of salamanders that uses this vernal pool, and another population that uses another vernal pool. But because one vernal pool may disappear over time for whatever reason, the other ones can then provide a source to that pool when it returns. So that provides a lot of resiliency to the natural metapopulations of these animals. And they support rare species. As we'll see at the end of this talk, we'll do a little video on the tiger salamander, which is a Maryland endangered species that occurs, again, can only breed in vernal pools. We did some studies at Maryland DNR that 26% of state listed amphibian species in the mid-Atlantic depend on vernal pools. So now just to dig in a little bit more into the biodiversity, these animals are disappearing before your eyes, but we'll talk about them. Amphibians. Again, this is one of, I think, the poster child, you might say, for vernal pools, because there are various amphibians that only live in vernal pools, can only breed in vernal pools. Back up one. Apologize again for moving multiple slides at one time. Not sure why that's happening, but anyway. So invertebrates, they're really cool animals. The fairy shrimp that you can see in the upper second from the right, it's the most common one thought, but there's lots of other invertebrates that use these pools. And as I said before, really it's part of a total ecosystem. And we'll do the amphibians. Here's a nice figure that describes when the eggs and larvae of these different mole salamanders, plus the wood frog and the eastern spadefoot toad, occur in our region. And this is going to be available for you. I've got some sources on the last slide that include the EPA seasonal pools guidebook that I was involved with, which includes this figure and the other species descriptions they're going to come up with. But here you can see the various different amphibians, these vernal pools, and we'll start with the spotted salamander, which is the most common mole salamander. And mole salamanders spend 95% of their time underground like a mole. So most people have never seen them. They only come above ground to breed in the vernal pool in the early spring, late winter, and they come and lay their eggs. And they mate. The males put down a spermatophore that the female takes up in her cloaca, and then she lays the eggs. And so there's actually internal fertilization, but not copulation. And they lay their eggs and they grow in vernal pools. And they go back as adults underground and eat grubs or whatever they like to eat. Lead this sort of shadow lifestyle. But here's the spotted salamander. You see it's throughout the mid-Atlantic. Quite a charming salamander with these bright yellow to orange spots along their back. You can see they get up to almost 8 inches long, so they're substantial size. And you can see the bottom right, you can see what the larva looks like. Marble salamander here is another mole salamander, less common. It occurs in this area. You can see from the map throughout most of Maryland. These actually lay their eggs in the fall. And so, well, that doesn't work. You just told me there's no water in the fall. As you can see in the upper right, they lay their eggs in the depression where they have learned from the past that will fill with water and become a vernal pool, and then they hatch out there. So they actually get a head start, and they begin to grow earlier than the marble salamanders, and there's actually some competition and predation between those two species where they co-occur. I'm trying to get the eastern tiger. Okay, so this is the other mole salamander that occurs in Maryland. There's actually one of the other two less common mole salamanders that occur This one is even larger, and you can see quite spectacular yellow markings, hence its name, tiger salamander. These occur mostly on the eastern shore and are state endangered species. Those of you familiar with the oxalotl, which is a mole salamander that never metamorphoses into an adult stage, but actually reproduces as a larva, occurs only naturally in the Lake Xochimilco of Mexico, but is now in labs throughout the world because they're quite an astounding animal, can regenerate entire limbs and so forth. But just so they're really, relation to this tiger salamander. And I think I missed Jefferson. So here's Jefferson. So this is the fourth. You can see only in sort of Western Maryland. In this region, I've seen them out near the west part of Montgomery County and southern Frederick County. But that's another little salamander that lives only in vernal pools, the Jefferson salamander. There's the wood frog. Okay, so among the frogs, again, we have two, and this is by far the most common. This would be the most common amphibian you would see in a vernal pool in this region. They're the earliest caller. You might hear some spring peepers, but you'll also hear these wood frogs very early in the year. And you can see the massive eggs there. Quite a lot of eggs are all put together, but they are, in essence, each egg is an individual, and they're all just clumped together, which is different than salamanders, which I'll show you. And you can see the tadpole at the bottom, which, unlike a salamander larva, doesn't have those legs immediately. I like them because they have that mask, and they're very cute. Okay, spadefoot toad. Actually, let me back up one slide. I'll talk about how cute they are and see if. Hopefully, folks can hear the call. Again, you've probably heard in the spring many times. February, March, calling. Spadefoot toad, a different looking frog. Again, is required a vernal pool. You can see that the toad eggs are more typical of the American toad or Fowler's toad, where they're more stringy-like than the wood frog eggs. And I'll give you the call for this. Oops. Not getting that call. Thank you. Perhaps not as melodious. Let's stay with that. Okay, I'm just showing a few of the rare frogs that also use vernal pools, which you would find in Maryland: barking tree frog, narrow-mouthed toad, and the carpenter frog, all of which are endangered or in need of conservation. These are some facultative frogs, which are more common. Again, these are ones that don't have to have a vernal pool to breed. They can lay their eggs in permanent ponds of water and will typically do that, but you'll certainly hear these. But they also use vernal pools, and I'll give you a little some examples of calls if I can. Sorry about this. Okay, there we go. So everyone's seeing this is jumping around a lot with one toggle. It's not showing me. That's a great tree frog. It's toggling when I try to switch from frog to frog, but we're hanging in there. American toad, you're familiar with.
Mark, do you want me to control from my end so that you can just tell me what to click and maybe that'll go smoother?
I think maybe that's what, because I've never done this where you've got the screen and I'm controlling, because it's just not really working very well.
Sure. No, we'll do that instead. So I'm going to take over and then you let me know what slide you want.
Yeah, so let's just back up and we'll give people a chance to hear some frog calls.
Back up. All right.
Right
here?
Right there. Facultative frog, yes. So start with a spring peeper. People most familiar with that. It works for you. Here we can switch from that one to the gray tree frog. Everyone's heard of spring peeper, I'm sure. Now you've got them all going together. You could actually do that if you'd like. The American toad will Bill, you may be familiar with. Go down to the pickerel frog. There's some beavers in the background, even in that recording. Go to the next, to the green frog, and I'm sure many of you know these calls, and some of you are hearing them and saying, "Oh, that's what that was." I've heard that many times. Green frog. The last one we have here is the bullfrog. Pretty distinctive. Okay, thank you, Hannah. We can move to the next slide. I mentioned these rare frogs. We can move on again. And I mentioned these that there are other mole salamanders that do the same thing. In other words, require vernal pools to breed, but these are ones that don't occur in Maryland, but are nearby in other states. Blue spotted, the mole, and the navy salamander. Next slide, please. So I mentioned what they're providing. We're providing for people our quality of life. Vernal pools bring a richness to your life. Again, really, they are backyard ecosystems. They're an opportunity for us, even in today's pandemic times, to go out in the wild and find an ecosystem and think about how it works. Some people have called them singing forests or healthy forests, and that usually is the case when you have vernal pools. Again, they provide all these pollution of the groundwater benefits, and from an ethical point of view, those that care about other forms of life will want to save vernal pools. Next slide. So now we get down to what can you do? So hopefully folks now are familiar with what vernal pools are, understand the variability they have, understand the values that they provide both to nature and to human beings, and they want to do something about it. And this is the case with everything. If you don't care about it unless you understand it. So the more we know, the more we will care. And hopefully that today is the first step toward understanding more and caring more about vernal pools. It's important to recognize that they exist in the woods near you. So they are out there. You can find them, just go out and enjoy them. And once you do that, I think you'll be even a greater advocate for their protection. And lastly, you can protect them in two ways. You can support inventories preservation, either through agencies or local organizations or individually, and preserve them where you can, or through legislation at both the state and local level. And last but not least, you can create vernal pools. As I mentioned before, some of them are created by man's use of the landscape, so they can be created in their backyard or in the area, and we'll talk a little more about that. Next slide. So the first one again is educate and enjoy. They're in your backyard. The important thing here is that the activity is at night. So a lot of people miss out on this. So the idea is to go out at dusk, take a headlamp or a flashlight, you know where you are, and you can enjoy the activity then. You'll see them during the day, but at night you'll see more activity, and that's when you'll hear the calls from the frogs as well. And if you're real lucky and should try this, different each year, try to go out and see if you can see the migration of the mole salamanders to the vernal pool. It's really spectacular. There is a movie, an IMAX movie that played at the Maryland Science Center not too long ago. When they reopened, they continue to reprise a number of educational videos in addition to their mainstream videos there at the IMAX, which is the largest screen in the state of Maryland. And there's one called Backyard Wilderness. And perhaps this might be available online, I'm not sure. But when I saw it, I was really amazed at the photography. It was focused on a family that lives in, I think, New York State, and the kids were stuck at home and had a science, this was before the pandemic, and they had a science assignment, and they ended up looking at the vernal pool in their backyard and seeing all the animals, and the photography was just amazing for the vernal pool as well as all the other animals in their forested area. And so you can use that and check out other resources and tell your friends about vernal pool. Next slide. Conserve and create. Okay. Well, one of the problems with vernal pools is that we don't know where they are. We don't know how many we have. So it's really hard to get a good management strategy at the local and state level. So that's one of the things we should do. We should work on figuring out how many we have and where they are. And then also, how can we create some more? Next slide. So inventory and conservation. So in Maryland, as in most states, there are federal Clean Water Act protections for wetlands. And in the state of Maryland, that's the case, delegated from EPA to the Maryland Department of the Environment. They protect non-tidal wetlands when they meet criteria of three things: when they have wet soils, when they have water, and when they have wetland vegetation. And some vernal pools qualify with that, but some do not. Some the soils are not hydric enough, they don't have the vegetation, so they're not protected by Maryland law. And even those that are protected are often never identified, because again, they might be dry in the summer when the surveys are done, people don't see them and they get paved over. So we're losing them rapidly throughout the state. But so certain states, including California, Maine, and Massachusetts, have gone about doing some inventories and have more strict laws protecting vernal pools specifically. This is especially important given the current situation on the federal level, where elimination of the Waters of the United States rule from the Obama administration by the Trump administration would eliminate protections for vernal pools at the federal level. No vernal pool would be protected under his rules. Maryland and Howard County can take action. So this is two places where here as residents, we can work to get agencies or organizations to do inventories and protect vernal pools. Next slide. So here's some information that I developed when I worked with the Maryland Biological Stream Survey, program of Maryland DNR. And what we did is look at the stream samples. Now more than 5,000 streams have been sampled by Maryland DNR since 1993. And we looked at how many vernal pools there were within 50 feet of those streams. So we're only looking at the stream riparian areas. We're not looking at the entire landscape. And it does turn out that there's at least as many vernal pools in the upland landscape as there are by the streams. And this is just to give you an idea of where you see them, how many there are per stream mile, and higher numbers where the slope is less, where it's more less steep. And the steeper areas, obviously, it's harder to retain water in a depression. But still, some pretty, just along the streams, there are quite a few per mile here. And if you consider all the other landscapes, there's tens of thousands of vernal pools in the state of Maryland. Next slide. But we don't know exactly where they are. Again, we just have a good feel for the numbers. About 25% of the ones that were sampled by the MVSS were occupied with vernal pool species, more than a third here in the Piedmont. 10% of those had obligate species, again, the ones that require vernal pools. So it's both obligate and facultative species that are using these vernal pools, and the wood frog was the most common. Next slide. Okay, so one of the things that I would like to see happen, and I know others would as well, is an inventory on whatever scale of the vernal pools in our area. Again, New Jersey and Virginia have done some studies like this, and they showed that actually there's 10% more vernal pools per unit area in the upland areas. So you can actually increase those numbers that I showed in the previous slide. And you can use LiDAR images. There's actually better and better remote sense images that can be used to find. LiDAR just gets 75%, but today we can even do better identifying them from the air during the winter when there's leaf off and they are full of water. So that's one way to go about an inventory. Another way is to crowdsource it and just get citizen scientists. And Patapsco Heritage Greenway will be piloting this idea. Hannah is working on an app that she's going to train stream watchers. So any of you who want to become a Patapsco Heritage Greenway stream watcher should contact Hannah and see if you can get involved with this. Pennsylvania and New York have already done similar things, and we hope to work with the Office of Community Sustainability in Howard County to even broaden this aspect of people going out and identifying vernal pools. Next slide. So here's how it will happen. Again, we're just on the verge of getting this going. There's something called the Water Reporter app, which is a national app that allows you to record data when you're out in the field. Of course, nowadays, whenever you do that, you get a GPS location, a fairly accurate location of where you are, which allows it to be mapped, and you can take a photograph. And what we're going to do is figure out the best other parameters that you would want to record. Obviously, if you see certain species, and get some idea of the size of the vernal pool, and those kinds of information can go into the app. We'll be able to build a map with attribute information throughout the Patapsco Heritage Greenway area, and hopefully the county and maybe even the state at some point. Just to let you know that there was a bill introduced by Delegate Terry Hill of Howard County that I prepared, which asked the state to do this inventory. But there was cost associated with it of $1.2 million, and so it was not approved. And so we're going to continue to figure out ways, hopefully, to get the state involved. But I'm not going to let it stop us. We're going to start on the local level and see what we can do about building inventories of vernal pools. Next. Okay, so building inventories is one thing, but building a vernal pool is another. This is something that we can all do, and it's being done across the country, and it's been done here. I've been involved with a couple of them that have been built, and so here's how you do it. Those who want to take it on, I think we can have a larger discussion. And again, get involved with Patapsco Heritage Greenway or some other group, and certainly I'm open to discussing this with anybody. First thing you need to do if you want to build a vernal pool is you scope out your site. If it's your land, that's one thing, but somebody else's land, of course, you'll need to have permission or permits. You need level ground. As I mentioned before, the western part of the state has fewer because ground slopes. And when the ground slopes, water runs off. So it needs to capture water. So you need a nice piece of level ground. And I think I mentioned, and I may have missed a couple of slides early on in the presentation about the size of these things, but probably the typical slide, the median side, where half are larger and half are smaller, probably maybe 1/4 of an acre. But they can be just a few square feet, or they can be multiple acres in size. So that really depends on what opportunities you have. So if you're doing your own, it depends on how much work you want to put into it. But something that's 5 feet or up to 30 feet diameter is reasonable. As I mentioned before, a foot, 14 inches would pretty much be how deep you'd want it to be. It can be a little deeper if it's got a lot of sun and have more evapotranspiration. Again, what you're trying to do is create something that will hold water during the winter and then drain or evaporate over the summer. So you dig out the site, and you can do it, by hand, depending on the soil and how much work you have, or you can use certain kinds of equipment, a bobcat, a small bulldozer, things like that. And you want to maintain, again, a flat area, so 10% less or slope is needed. You want to remove sharp sticks and stuff, because the next step, which is important, we talked about wanting it to drain a little, but not too much. And so really, you want the water to disappear, so usually it'll evaporate, and you don't want it to be draining, to put it that way. So in some cases, you have a clay liner naturally, or a soil profile that holds the water, and that's fine. You can do that with a simple test of digging through the water and pouring water in and see how fast it drains. If it does drain, then of course you'll need to line it. So you're going to be creating your own, basically, clay layer, but you can do that with a geotextile pad and putting soil on top of that. So that's basically, you create that, you anchor it down, Make sure it's smooth so that you don't poke any holes in it. And you add 6 inches of soil on top of that and maintain the same slope. And then you fill the vernal pool. Now you can just let rain do it. That's probably the best way, or you can actually fill it up if you like. And you can put native seeds or mulch the edges, add branches for habitat, make it whatever you want at that point. If you have the right area and you have the right water holding capacity, then you'll have a vernal pool. One of the other things I think a slide that was missed earlier was that the vernal pool is the water area, but it really includes the woodland landscape in addition to that. So the next 100 feet around your pool will be where the mole salamanders and the frogs live during the non-breeding period, and probably out to 1,000 feet is how far they would go, but the majority will be within 100 feet. So you really should think about what kind of habitat is adjacent to that, because obviously if you put a vernal pool in the middle of your front green lawn, you're not going to have much habitat, but if you put it in a nice wooded area, it'll be successful. Next slide. So here's an example of an ambitious one at a school, and you can see there's a bunch of folks there, and there's some equipment being involved. A backhoe digging this one out to make a large one. Next slide. And here's some other examples of folks doing it, by hand. A bunch of kids that are involved. But again, getting the slope right. There's a lot of different ways to do this. There's a man named Tom Biebighauser from Kentucky who's been telling people how to do this and helping them do it. He actually came to Wheaton Regional Park in Maryland, and I was there, and we built a vernal pool with his advice there, and that worked out very well. It began to attract amphibians very quickly. So again, it can be done. It's being done all the time. Next slide. And this was the last sequence of pictures. This is my wife, Mary, and this is the vernal pool we put in our backyard. And this was really simple, and it really wasn't even conceived as a vernal pool. It was basically, I was gonna put a little pond, provide some water for birds and wildlife, and there are a lot. My little game camera shows that I've got everything from fox, raccoon, deer, crows, hawks, everything you might imagine. But the good news, next slide, is that within 5 years, wood frog eggs showed up. Again, these are the wood frog eggs. You can see each of the eggs is very distinct, but all clumped together. I was quite happy about that because I had had green frogs, pickerel frogs, and other animals, but I hadn't had an obligate vernal pool species, and the wood frog showed up. So they found it. And this is at a house that is 1 kilometer from the Columbia Mall. So I'm not out in the rural areas. I'm right in the middle of suburbia. Next slide. And even more surprising, 3 years later, we saw these eggs. And you'll see the little difference here. The eggs are in a larger envelope of gel, and that is salamander eggs, mole salamander eggs. In this case, the spotted salamander. So the next slide. We'll show you that, again, living this close, but having a nice wooded backyard with an easement running through the neighborhood. There was enough undisturbed soil. If an area has been graded and compacted, you're going to lose your mole salamanders because they need to live in the burrows in the soil. But fortunately, they saved some of the trees in our development, and there are mole salamanders that are surviving back there, and they found this pond. And there's the female that laid the eggs, and below her is a juvenile that we saw a couple of years later in the yard. Next slide. And here's the sources I promised you. At the top is really the best overall source that I was involved with, Brown and Young, Mid-Atlantic vernal pools, and there's some other good ones in the Northeast. A lot of work's been done. There's the Tom Biebighauser guide on creating them. Henry Wilbur, who was actually one of my doctoral advisors, did a great survey paper on amphibian lifestyles that sort of explain how this works. And then the last one that I just added is a field guide to amphibian larvae and eggs from the Midwest, but it works for most of our species. So you want to be able to tell the different eggs of different frogs and salamanders, as well as their larvae. That's there. Next slide. So I'd like to sort of close with this poem from Robert Frost. These pools that, though in forest, still reflect the total sky almost without defect, and like the flowers beside them, chill and shiver, will like the flowers beside them soon be gone, and yet not out by any brook or river, but up by roots to bring dark foliage on. The trees that have it in their pent-up buds to darken nature and be summer woods, let them think twice before they use their powers to blot out and drink up and sweep away these flowery waters and these watery flowers from snow that melted on yesterday. So I think there's, beyond the scientific and environmental and ethical, something of a poetic reason for saving vernal pools. Next slide, Hannah. So this here again is our wood frog with her eggs right there in a local pond. And I think at this point, we'll show you another video from the last few minutes. Any questions? I don't know if there's anything in the chat. Let me take a quick look.
Let's see.
One of my cats is loving these frog calls. That's a good one.
All right, let's see, Q&A. Just the one from the beginning.
I don't know if we reminded folks that they can ask questions, but we certainly can do that now. Anybody wants to ask any questions in the chat?
Hey, Mark, we have a question. How do the shrimp get into the pools?
How do the shrimp get into the pools? Because they don't fly or anything like that, right? So they get carried there so they have this really interesting cyst-like eggs which get picked up by other animals. So they are hitchhikers. So it could be an amphibian, it could be a bird, it could be something like that. As I mentioned before, turns out the rusty blackbirds, nobody really knew until recently that they use vernal pools all the time. I'm not sure why, but when they go in there and they splash around, they can pick up the eggs of the fairy shrimp and carry them to another vernal pool.
Great. We have another question. How can a Maryland County legislative body help, in this specific case, Frederick County?
Okay, well, I mentioned the state effort. So there is a bill, I remember the number of it, but that Delegate Terry Hill sponsored this year, which was asking for an inventory by the state. I think we could do the same thing in any of the counties. I've already had discussions in Howard County, but Frederick County, Montgomery, Anne Arundel, Baltimore, all those counties, you can create an inventory. And I think any of them that are interested in doing that. The other thing, obviously, the inventory is to give people a better feel for where they are. If you don't know they're there, they're likely not to be protected. The second step, which was included in the state bill, was that, okay, once you've done the inventory, we would like recommendations on how you can protect them. And ideally, we would like laws like they have in California and Maine to protect them with additional regulations, so that, for example, when you're developing a piece of land and you look for wetlands, which is required, you also look for vernal pools, and you check them in the winter, not just in the summer, et cetera, so that you know where the vernal pools are and they can receive some kind of protection. So I would say talk to your legislators at every level, and I'm happy to be involved with that.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions at this point. Okay, wait, got one more. Let's see. It looked like the vernal pool in your yard was a standard fiberglass pond liner. Is that true? And do you ever clean it out?
Yes and yes, but not always. So that's a good catch. And I didn't give more details, but as I said, I put that in there not anticipating a vernal pool per se, because it holds water all year round. But so what I've done is some years I will just clean it out. I'll just take all the water out of it, just to sort of mimic a vernal pool. Some years I leave it in there. But the key feature, as you'll remember back from the beginning of our talk, is that there are no fish in it. As long as there's no fish in it, these species can use it. And sometimes you'll find wood frogs breeding in a fountain or something like that that's permanent. But again, the key feature is that there's no fish. It doesn't happen in a natural permanent water body. But in an artificial one like this, that can be the case. So it was an easy way to put one in. It's just a liner from a Home Depot that you put in the ground. And you can clean it out or not. Either way, it still seems to serve the purpose.
Great, thank you. And then one more question is, how is the best way to contact you? Anybody who's registered for this webinar through the Eventbrite link, I'll send a follow-up email to, and I'll get any of those resources from Mark that he wants to pass along, as well as any contact information for him. So if you registered, because I know the actual webinar itself through Zoom didn't require registration, but if you registered through our Eventbrite page, you will be getting a follow-up email. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so if there's no other questions, I figure at this point we can play this final video, and for those who want to stay and watch it, they can. If you have somewhere else to be, that's totally fine to exit now, but I just want to make sure we show this video for the people who can stick around a little bit longer.
Sure. It's pretty short and it's worthwhile. It's from Maryland DNR, and I think the River Keeper up in Cecil County. But anyway, go ahead.
All right, let's do this.
On an oddly sunny day in mid-February, volunteers from the Susquehannock Wildlife Society and other organizations joined Scott Smith, a wildlife ecologist with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, to trudge through ice-covered wetlands in order to collect population data on a beautiful and rarely seen creature, the eastern tiger salamander. With unique habitat often comes unique species. On the eastern shore of Maryland, the Delmarva Bay ecosystem is no exception. Host to a variety of rare or endangered plants and amphibian species, these seasonal wetlands form from large depressions in the ground that hold rainwater and snowmelt just long enough to prevent the establishment of fish predators, but allow for the breeding and metamorphosis of these endangered populations of our largest terrestrial salamander. One that, depending on weather conditions, can breed from late fall to spring, but usually by late winter, and then spends most of the year underground. We conducted visual surveys of the Delmarva Bays to look for egg masses, a sign of not only the presence of these salamanders in each particular wetland, but an indicator of health for these populations. During this survey, we encountered several other members of the Delmarva Bay ecosystem: the eastern painted turtle, green frog tadpoles, and a handful of eastern red-spotted newts. A cold but still lively eastern snapping turtle. We were excited to find so many tiger salamander egg masses, but we really hoped to get to see an adult up close. Suddenly, we found one sitting on the bottom of the wetland. Wow, what an impressive creature. The first thing we noted was that these are much larger than their smaller, more common cousins, the spotted salamander and marbled salamanders that we are used to seeing back home. They also exhibit a unique pattern of coloration, a paddle-like tail that acts as a rudder, and a broader head. The sites we were surveying have been preserved and managed by Maryland DNR for the purpose of protecting and hopefully increasing this incredible creature and the biodiversity of this habitat in which it lives. Recorded data indicates that by removing trees from the depression basin and opening the canopy to sunlight, these areas are enhanced for rare plants and amphibians like the tiger salamander and barking tree frog. A number of these wetlands were found to be colonized by these species almost immediately after this management occurred. We feel truly fortunate that we were able to see one of these great treasures for ourselves, and that they are in good hands, hopefully for many generations to come. It is reassuring that a species once thought to be on the brink of extinction locally appears to be on their way to bounce back, so that they may reclaim their rightful place as the tigers of the Delmarva Bays.
All right. Thank you again. That's pretty much it for our first webinar. We really appreciate you all joining us, and thank you to Dr. Southerland for presenting, and we really appreciate all your expertise on this subject. Like I said before, we'll send a follow-up email with any of the resources that Dr. Southerland wants to pass along, as well as any contact information. We appreciate everyone stopping by for our first webinar. I know there were some technical difficulties, but we're definitely getting the hang of it. So we'll have some more in the future. Next week, I'll have our Stream Watcher training, and then further down the line, we're going to have more webinars on invasive plants and some other topics relating to the Patapsco watershed. So thank you again. We really appreciate your time. And thank you, Dr. Southerland.